And welcome to this edition of the Native News Update on this Wednesday, August 25th. I'm your host for today's program, Paul DeMain. Many of the stories read here can also be found at our website at IndianCountryNews.com. So here are the news stories for the day from the Associated Press and other Native news sources. How the nation's tribes can best implement sex offender registration and notification systems was the subject of a meeting among federal, state, and tribal judicial officials last week in New Mexico. Dozens of judges, prosecutors, tribal leaders, and police officers huddled together inside the San Ildefonso Pueblo's gymnasium, working on a problem facing tribes across the nation. The Adam Welsh Child Protection and Safety Act of 2006, named after the slain son of America's most wanted television host John Walsh, requires convicted violent sex offenders to register with local authorities, increases punishments for some federal crimes against children, and strengthens child pornography protections. The deadlines to implement registration programs that comply with the act was at the end of July, but officials with the U.S. Department of Justice have granted one-year extensions to 184 tribes, including many in New Mexico. Only two tribes, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Reservation in Oregon and the Yakama Nation in Washington, have complied with the laws, while others have opted out, meaning they will allow states to register sex offenders living or working in their jurisdictions. The Applied Research Center, the nation's leading think tank on race, is presenting Facing Race 2010, the largest multiracial gathering of leaders, educators, journalists, and advocates on racial justice in the country, with a comprehensive lineup of presentations and workshops covering a breadth of racial justice issues, prestigious speakers, and expecting more than 1,000 participants. Facing Race is the nation's premier conference on racial justice to be held coming up on September 23rd to the 25th at the McCormick Hyatt Regency in Chicago, Illinois. Facing Race has become a pivotal event for galvanizing communities on racial justice issues, said Applied Research Center President and Executive Director Rinku Sen. Key issues to be covered at Facing Race include debunking post-racial America, economic and green jobs, reproductive justice, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender communities, millennials and the 2010 elections, disparities in health care reform, SB 1070 and immigrant rights, educational equity, welfare, and criminal justice. For more information, you might want to contact Rebecca Spagulia at RSPICUGLIA. We'll put it up on the board for you to see at arc.org or call 415-290-2970. And we'll put those up. And today we go to Alaska to talk with Alaskan Public Radio Network News Director Lori Townsend on the elections they held there and what that might hold for Alaskan tribes and corporations. Lori Townsend, Alaska had some primary elections yesterday. Tell us a little bit about the results up there and tell us how some of this may impact the Native communities.
Well, Paul, in Alaska, there is no figuring politics because we're surprised all the time. We think we know how things may go, and we're continually surprised, and certainly this primary election was no different. The race that people were watching quite closely was between Lisa Murkowski, our U.S. Senator, who is a Republican, and a challenger named Joe Miller, who has the backing of the Tea Party Express and didn't have a lot of money. And people figured that Lisa Murkowski would prevail. She was appointed, but then she won her re-election and has quickly risen to the top as far as becoming part of the Republican leadership. She's on various committees, the Appropriations Committee. She's on the Indian Affairs Committee. She's on a number of prominent positions. And 2 days ago, I had heard that she was polling about 70% of the vote in the Anchorage area. And right now, all the ballots have not been counted. There are still thousands of absentee ballots out there that need to be counted yet. But as it stands currently, Joe Miller is ahead of her. Now, he's only ahead of her by about 1,490 votes, so just under 1,500 votes. And that could certainly change. We saw that change
in a Stevens race, right?
Yes, absolutely. Senator Stevens was ahead of Democratic challenger, Mark Begich, and the absentee ballots that were still out were from rural Alaska, Bush, Alaska, where Stevens had always had a lot of support because he has brought so much money to Bush, Alaska. So the assumption was that certainly when the ballots would be counted from rural Alaska, that Senator Stevens would prevail and stay on. And it got turned around. Mark Begich came from behind, considerably much farther behind than Lisa Murkowski is. He was, I think, 3,000 votes behind. So this race is not over. And Lisa Murkowski certainly hasn't conceded. She said, we'll wait. They have faith that the Bush will come in for her. And we'll find out.
This is being watched because, number one, Murkowski was an incumbent, and her opponent is a member of the Tea Party supporters within the Republican Party, and he was endorsed by
Sarah Palin, yes, very strongly. In fact, she, in the last several days, has come out. Sarah and Todd Palin both have pushed for support for Joe Miller. So this will be seen nationally as a big win for Palin and her influence in elections if Joe Miller prevails and wins. And if whoever faces the Democratic challenger in the fall, I just came from the press conference with Scott McAdams, who is the mayor of Sitka, and he has the Democratic nomination now and will face either Miller if he continues on or Murkowski. And he was asked about facing off with Miller, and he said, well, he's an Ivy League lawyer. I'm a small town mayor, and I'm also a guy who was in the commercial fishing industry, and he's saying things that will resonate well with Alaskans. And he said, we're not going to let Joe Miller and the Tea Party start to put down roots in Alaska. And so we'll see how this message plays out in the next few months. It'll be interesting to watch.
Right. From a political point of view now, I think this may have been the first or second Tea Party candidate in the United States that's won. McCain, of course, overcame some of that by going a little bit to the right in the primary, and he's probably going to have to go a little bit to the left to get back into the mainstream as a centrist again. Having won that primary, and prevailing wisdom tends to be on the Democratic side that it might be better for a centrist Democrat to have a further right-wing ideologue running against them rather than someone who has a history like Murkowski.
That is the speculation with some of the pundits here also, that McAdams has a better chance running against an unknown, relatively unknown, and never has held office before, Joe Miller, rather than going up against Lisa Murkowski. Now, we don't know if Lisa Murkowski, if the absentee ballots come in and Miller prevails, if she may decide to run as an independent. And that would be an interesting race also if that were to happen. So it will be fun to watch, as politics always are in Alaska. But the thing about Senator Murkowski being on the Indian Affairs Committee is significant, and we don't know what Miller's thoughts are about tribes. We do know that he's against the Department of Education. He wants to phase out Medicare. He wants a federalist system where states have power and the federal government does not. So we don't know what that means for his relationship with tribes if he were
He's not the kind of candidate that's in favor of saying that if you send $100,000 of tax money to Washington, D.C., you should get at least $100,000 back, not 5 times what the state sends to D.C.?
Well, he is not in favor of federal dollars, but the thing that Senator Murkowski and Senator Stevens always said was that Alaska's a young state, and we have a lot of challenges here, and we're trying to catch up. I mean, I'm not defending one side or the other, but that was their argument for why they drove a lot of federal money to Alaska.
Always got more money back than what they sent to D.C.
Yes.
Tell us this. What effect does the Native community, when you relate to what's going on in the bush, what kind of percentage of vote comes out of the bush?
Um, that's a excellent question, and one that I can't answer right now. I'll have to look at those numbers, and that was part of our frustration last evening. Is that the way the elections results come in? We have no idea what precincts are coming in, so we couldn't tell where these votes were coming from, and that makes it frustrating because you don't know if it's from strongholds for Murkowski, if it's coming from strongholds for Miller. And the percentage, obviously, the urban areas are vastly have the vast majority of the vote. The Anchorage, Matsu area, Fairbanks, and then Juneau. And so the percentage-wise, nearly half the population lives in the Anchorage area of the state of Alaska. So the Bush vote will be important, but the urban vote is where everyone plays to. Although they realize that they can't ignore rural Alaska because the tribes do have influence.
Have you seen the emergence of Native Tea Party supporters? There are a few around the country. We see them. Have you seen anything that would be inclined to be support from the Native community for that? In part because there's a history of tribes and tribal governments kind of being on the Republican philosophy of less government is better government. Direct Washington, D.C. to tribal relationships, get out county, tribes, and states out of the way, but have that relationship nation to nation from D.C. to the local level. You see anything like that?
Have not seen that. In fact, the only Tea Party rallies, Tea Party Express rallies that we've seen in the state, one was held in Juneau, and 9 people showed up. A few of those were reporters. In Homer, there was another Tea Party rally. 3 people showed up. One of those was a reporter. And so this support is kind of difficult to gauge. But I haven't seen any tribal involvement in it, but that's an excellent question and one that we'll have to watch closely going toward November. I'd like to talk a little bit about the other race that I think is very significant to Indian country, and that is for lieutenant governor. And Diane Benson, who is a Tlingit woman here, lives in the Anchorage area, very involved politically and with a lot of Native rights issues, has run in the past. She ran as a Green Party candidate for governor in 2002, and then she ran again for the U.S. House against Don Young in 2005, and ran on a platform of ending the war in Iraq. Her son, Latsine, was injured very, very severely in 2005 in Iraq. And so she ran on this platform. I'm sorry, she ran for U.S. House in 2006, and her son was injured in 2005. She came back now. She got, last night she got, I believe it was just about 65% of the vote for lieutenant governor. So she will be the Democratic nominee for lieutenant governor.
Well, I was going to say it's on the Democratic nominee. Are they forced to team up, or can you have a Republican governor and a Democratic lieutenant governor? Interesting.
Yes, it's a separate race. The lieutenant governor, oftentimes the candidates do end up pairing up. We expect that to happen with Sean Parnell, who is planning to sort of run with Meade Treadwell, who is the Republican candidate for lieutenant governor. And it's possible and could happen that Diane Benson and Ethan Berkowitz, who is the likely Democratic candidate for governor, will team up and run together. They did run against each other in the past, but she said last night, told me that they could overcome that, and she thinks they'd do well together.
Give us your URL for where people can find your programming up there.
They can find all of our stories at aprn.org.
We'll have to catch up with you again in the near future. Thanks for joining with us today, Lori.
Sure. Thanks, Paul.
And that is the latest roundup of news from Indian Country on this edition of the Native News Update. We want to thank you all for coming here and taking a peek at us. Come back again soon.